She was balancing a heavy crystal carafe of aged soju when she heard the code phrase that was about to turn a king into a target. Talia didn't miss a step, didn't shift her gaze, didn't let her hand shake for even a millisecond. That was the professional standard at the Obsidian, Seoul's most impenetrable high-rise lounge, where the city lights glittered 40 floors below like diamonds, a playground for men who treated lives like currency. You learn very quickly in a place like this how to keep your face as blank as a screen while your brain is calculating the body count. She poured the drink, offered a perfect, respectful bow, and vanished into the shadows of the hallway. Then, she circled back to the private VIP booth and listened closer. Now, before we go any further, if you've ever walked past a conversation you weren't supposed to hear and felt that cold prickle of, do I stay quiet or do I save a life? This story is going to hit you hard. Stay with me because what Talia did next, risking everything to speak, didn't just change her night. It set her on a collision course with a dynasty she never should have touched. Drop a comment right now. If you were standing there, would you risk your job to warn a man who would never even look you in the eye? Keep that answer in mind, because by the end of this, you might surprise yourself. The VIP booth was tucked behind thick, soundproof glass, a layer of privacy that cost more than a year of college tuition and came with a tacit agreement. What happens in here, stays in here. But Talia had been assigned to that booth specifically because she was good at being invisible. 10 months she'd worked at the Obsidian. 10 months of carrying plates worth more than her car, enduring the insults of men who assumed a Black American waitress was just uneducated help, and going home to a cramped studio while dreaming of a life she couldn't afford. She thought she was just serving dinner. She had no idea she was serving a death warrant. The condensation from the silver ice bucket felt like a second skin against Talia's palms as she navigated the crowded floor of the Obsidian. To the elite patrons of Seoul, she was a ghost in a white button-down, a tool designed to keep their glasses full and their secrets ignored. But Talia Henderson had lived a life that required her to be hyper-aware of every shift in a room's temperature. She didn't just serve, she observed. She reached the far corner of the VIP terrace, where the investors from the States were holding court. They were loud, dressed in suits that cost more than her 4 years of college tuition, and they treated the waitstaff with a casual, practiced dismissiveness. As she leaned in to set down a fresh bottle of vintage champagne, the man in the charcoal gray suit, a man everyone called the Fixer, didn't even pause his story. "I'm telling you," the Fixer said, his voice dropping into a gritty, low-country drawl that felt out of place in this neon-lit skyscraper. By the time the casket dropped at that funeral in Busan, the deal was already dead. We just needed the old man to follow suit. The men around him erupted into a sharp, jagged laughter that made the hair on Talia's arms stand up. It wasn't the sound of businessmen celebrating a win. It was the sound of hyenas over a carcass. "And tonight?" one of the younger associates asked, his eyes darting toward the private inner chamber where Seo Jae-Hyuk was currently finishing his meal. "The boss thinks he's signing a peace treaty. He has no idea the ink is actually blood." Talia's hand didn't shake as she poured the golden liquid. She kept her gaze fixed on the bubbles rising in the glass, but her mind was racing through 1,000 scenarios. She had heard that slang before. The ink is blood, back home, in the neighborhoods where a contract wasn't a piece of paper, but a death warrant. They weren't here to invest in the CO syndicate. They were here to decapitate it. "He thinks he's safe because his kid is with him," the Fixer chuckled, reaching for his glass. His fingers brushed Talia's as he took it, but he didn't even look at her. To him, she was just a delivery system for alcohol. That's the beauty of it. We get the king and the prince in one room, and the whole board resets. Talia stepped back, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked toward the heavy oak doors of the private suite. Behind them sat Seo Jae-Hyuk, a man the world called a monster, but a man who was currently sharing a quiet dinner with his teenage son. She knew the rules of survival. Keep your head down. Do your job. Don't get involved in the business of dangerous men. But as she watched the Fixer check his watch and nod toward the elevators, Talia realized that if she walked away now, she wasn't just staying out of trouble. She was choosing to be an accomplice to a murder. She clutched her serving tray like a shield, the cold weight of the metal grounding her. She could feel the invisible thread of the conspiracy tightening around the room, connecting the laughter at this table to the tragedy waiting behind those doors. The air in the lounge suddenly felt too thin, the lights too bright. She had 10 seconds to decide. She could head to the kitchen, clock out, and disappear into the safety of the Seoul subway system. Or she could cross the floor, break every protocol of the most exclusive club in the world, and tell a mafia boss that he was about to die. Talia took a breath, adjusted her apron, and turned toward the private suite. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the only person in the room who knew the truth, and she was about to make herself very, very visible. Talia felt the cold condensation from the silver tray seep into her fingertips, but the chill inside the private suite was far more biting. Inside the soundproof glass of the VIP room, the air was thick with the scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco, the smell of men who decided the fate of cities over appetizers. Across the mahogany table, the lead investor, a man with a smile as sharp and synthetic as a diamond, leaned back. He switched from formal Korean to a fast, low-slung English, peppered with specific street slang from the States. Slang he clearly thought a waitress in Seoul wouldn't be able to decode. "The package is in the foyer," the man said, his eyes never leaving Seo Jae-Hyuk's face. "Once we sign, we drop the hammer and clear the floor. No witnesses, no loose ends." He wasn't talking about a business merger. He was talking about a massacre. Talia's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew the protocol. Be a ghost, be a shadow, be nothing. But her gaze drifted to the right of the table, where Seo Min-jun sat. The boy couldn't have been more than 19, dressed in a suit that looked like armor he hadn't yet grown into. He was staring at his father with a quiet, desperate kind of loyalty. If she stayed silent, that loyalty was going to get him buried. She didn't think, she moved. The silence of the room shattered as Talia stepped out of the shadows. She didn't just walk to the table, she invaded it. The bodyguards at the door tensed, their hands twitching toward their jackets, but Jae-Hyuk raised a single, manicured hand to stay them. He didn't look at her with fear, only a profound, insulted curiosity. "The wine is finished," he said, his voice a low, melodic growl in Korean. "Leave." Talia didn't leave. She leaned forward, her hands bracing against the edge of the table, breaking the sacred distance between the server and the served. She pointed a trembling but certain finger directly at the man across from him. "He's lying to you," she said, her voice cracking before finding its edge. "They aren't here for a deal, Mr. Seo. They just told their team to drop the hammer in the foyer. That's not investment talk. That's a hit." The room went tomb quiet. The rival investors froze, their expressions flickering from predatory to panicked for a split second before smoothing back into masks of outrage. Jae-Hyuk's eyes widened, then narrowed into lethal slits. He looked at Talia's dark skin, her service apron, and the desperation in her eyes, and a cruel smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. "You think," Jae-Hyuk began, his voice dropping to a dangerous octave, "that a waitress who clears my plates has the standing to interrupt a billion-won transaction? You are a child playing at a hero's game. Do you have any idea what I do to people who waste my time with fantasies?" He leaned in closer, the scent of his cologne overwhelming her. "You're looking for a payout. Or perhaps you're just delusional. Get out before I decide your life is as disposable as the glass you just filled." Talia felt the heat of humiliation rise to her cheeks. She had risked her life, and he was stepping on her like an insect. She started to back away, her soul crushing under the weight of her own perceived insignificance. But then a hand reached out. Min-jun, who had been as still as a statue, placed his hand on his father's forearm. The movement was small, but in this room it was seismic. Jae-Hyuk paused, his fury momentarily sidelined by his son's touch. "Father," Min-jun whispered. The boy didn't look at Talia, he looked at the rival investor's hands, which were now gripped tightly beneath the table. "She's not lying." Jae-Hyuk's brow furrowed. "Min-jun, stay out of." "He's wearing the ring," Min-jun interrupted, his voice hushed but piercing. "The one from the funeral in Busan last month." The one you said belonged to the man who tried to take the docks. She mentioned the foyer. I saw his driver head toward the elevators 5 minutes ago with a violin case. There's no music scheduled for tonight. The transformation in Jae-Hyuk was instantaneous. The confusion vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. He looked at his son, then back at Talia, seeing her for the very first time. He didn't see a waitress anymore. He saw a variable he hadn't accounted for. At the other end of the table, the lead investor realized the game was up. His hand moved toward his waistband, but he was too slow. Talia, Jae-Hyuk said, his voice no longer a growl, but a command. Get down. The word down hadn't even fully left Jae-Hyuk's lips before the world disintegrated into a deafening roar of shattered crystal and lead. The frosted glass panels of the VIP suite, once a symbol of elite privacy, exploded inward like 1,000 glittering diamonds turned into shrapnel. Talia didn't think. She felt the raw, instinctive pull of survival. She lunged toward Minjun, grabbing the sleeve of his expensive wool blazer and dragging him beneath the heavy mahogany table just as a line of bullet holes stitched a jagged path across the velvet wallpaper where the boy's head had been a second before. Above them, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and acrid gunpowder. Jae-Hyuk was a blur of lethal motion. He hadn't scrambled for cover like a common man. He had overturned the massive table with a strength born of pure adrenaline, creating a temporary barricade. His bodyguards were already engaging, the muffled thwip-thwip of suppressed handguns echoing against the louder, more chaotic spray of the rival faction's submachine guns. Father. Minjun's voice was thin, choked with the dust of pulverized drywall. Stay behind her. Jae-Hyuk roared over the din, his eyes meeting Talia's for a fraction of a second. There was no mockery left in his gaze, only a terrifying, razor-sharp focus. Get him out of here, waitress. Now. Talia's lungs burned, but her mind was remarkably clear. She knew this building better than the architects did. She knew which floorboards creaked, which cameras had blind spots, and most importantly, she knew the veins of the obsidian, the narrow, windowless service tunnels used by staff to move trash and linens without offending the eyes of the wealthy. Follow me, Talia shouted, grabbing Minjun's hand. Her grip was bruised tight, a silent promise that she wouldn't let go. She stayed low, crawling through the wreckage of the suite toward the back wall. While the gunmen focused their fire on the overturned table and Jae-Hyuk's return fire, Talia kicked aside a fallen decorative screen to reveal a small, inconspicuous wooden panel used for the dumbwaiter maintenance. It was a tight squeeze, meant for technicians not Mafia royalty, but it was their only hope. She shoved Minjun into the dark opening just as a grenade thudded onto the plush carpet of the dining room. Move, she screamed. They tumbled into the narrow service corridor just as the explosion rocked the building. The shockwave slammed the wooden panel shut, plunging them into a claustrophobic world of concrete and exposed pipes. The sound of the battle above became a dull, rhythmic thumping, like a dying heartbeat. Talia didn't stop to catch her breath. She pulled a small flashlight from her apron pocket, the one she used to check wine vintages in the cellar, and swept the beam across the damp walls. This leads to the freight elevator in the basement, she whispered, her voice echoing in the hollow space. The sensors are tied to the staff keycards. They won't expect us to come out near the loading docks. Minjun was trembling, his breathing ragged, but he kept his eyes locked on the back of Talia's white shirt. My father, he's still up there. Your father is a ghost in a suit, Minjun, Talia said, turning to look at him with a fierce, sudden intensity. But right now, you're the prize they're hunting. If we stay here, we both die. If we move, we give him a reason to fight his way out. They moved through the labyrinth, the air growing colder and smelling of industrial grease. Talia navigated the turns with a haunting precision, her shadows dancing against the concrete. Every time a pipe hissed or a rat scurried, Minjun flinched, but Talia's hand remained a steady, grounding force. When they finally reached the heavy steel door of the basement level, Talia swiped her card. The light flickered from red to green with a soft, mechanical click. She pushed the door open just a crack, peering out into the rainy, oil-slicked alleyway behind the skyscraper. A black sedan sat idling 50 yards away, its headlights cutting through the Seoul mist. Jae-Hyuk was already there, leaning against the door with a bleeding shoulder and a look of grim satisfaction. He had anticipated her path. As they ran toward the car, the rain washing the soot from their faces, Jae-Hyuk grabbed Talia by the arm. His grip wasn't violent, but it was possessive. He looked at the girl who had saved his legacy, then at the service tunnels she had emerged from. The waitress who knew too much, he murmured, his voice a dark caress against the sound of sirens in the distance. The obsidian is gone, Talia. You're coming with us. Talia didn't look back at the tower. She looked at the blood on Jae-Hyuk's sleeve and the terror in Minjun's eyes, and she realized the invisible thread hadn't been cut. It had just been pulled tighter. The black sedan tore through the rain-slicked outskirts of Seoul, the engine a low, predatory hum that swallowed the sound of the city. Inside, the silence was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of Minjun and the metallic click of Jae-Hyuk checking the chamber of his sidearm. Talia sat pressed against the cold leather of the door, her white waitress shirt stained with soot and a dark smear of someone else's blood. She watched the neon lights of the city fade into the jagged shadows of the Bukhansan Mountains, realizing that the life she knew, the shifts, the tips, the invisibility, was burning in the rear-view mirror. When the car finally slowed, it wasn't at a police station or a hospital. It was at a sprawling estate hidden behind 10-foot stone walls topped with electrified wire. The gates hummed open like the jaws of a silent beast, admitting them into a world of manicured gardens and sharp-eyed men in tactical gear who didn't blink as the battered car lurched to a halt. Out, Jae-Hyuk commanded. His voice was steady now, the adrenaline of the shootout replaced by a terrifying, icy composure. Talia stepped onto the gravel, the mountain air biting through her thin clothes. The estate was a masterclass in gilded security, floor-to-ceiling glass that was undoubtedly bulletproof, and minimalist architecture that left no place for a traitor to hide. Jae-Hyuk didn't lead her to a guest room. He led her to a high-walled study filled with the scent of old paper and expensive cognac. Minjun tried to follow, his eyes searching Talia's for some shred of the comfort she'd offered in the tunnels, but a silent nod from his father sent him away with a house physician. The door clicked shut, leaving Talia alone with the most dangerous man in South Korea. Jae-Hyuk moved to a sideboard, pouring a finger of amber liquid. He didn't offer her any. Instead, he turned, leaning against the heavy desk, his silhouette framed by the moonlight hitting the mountains behind him. He looked at her not as a savior, but as a puzzle he intended to pull apart. You knew the service tunnels of the Obsidian better than my own security detail, Jae-Hyuk began, his voice dropping to that lethal, melodic frequency. You decoded a slang-heavy dialect of English used by a specific subsect of Atlantic mercenaries. And you did it all while carrying a tray of appetizers. Talia squared her shoulders, refusing to let her knees shake. I've worked there for 10 months, Mr. Seo. When you're invisible, you have a lot of time to study the walls. And the English? I'm from Atlanta. I didn't need a textbook to know they were talking about a hit. Jae-Hyuk stepped into the light. The blood on his shoulder had dried, but the ferocity in his eyes was vivid. He circled her slowly, like a wolf gauging the throat of a stray. Convenient. A girl from the exact city my enemies hail from, working at the exact table where they planned my end, happens to have a heart of gold and the tactical knowledge to lead my heir through a maze. He stopped inches from her, his presence an overwhelming weight. He reached out, his thumb catching a smudge of soot on her cheek, his touch surprisingly hot against her cold skin. Tell me, Talia Henderson, are you the luckiest waitress in the world, or are you the most sophisticated plant the syndicate has ever encountered? Did they send you to save me just so you could get inside these walls? If I wanted you dead, I would have stayed in the kitchen, Talia snapped, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and fury. I risked my life for a boy who looked like he didn't belong in that room. If that makes me a spy in your head, then you're as paranoid as they say. Jae-Hyuk's eyes flared, a flicker of something amusement, perhaps, or genuine surprise, crossing his face. He pulled his hand back, his gaze raking over her disheveled form. He couldn't decide. She was either his greatest debt or his greatest threat. "For now, you are a guest," he said, though the word felt like a sentence. "You will stay in the East Wing. You will not use a phone. You will not leave the grounds. My men will watch you sleep, and they will watch you eat." He walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the brass handle. "If you are a hero, Talia, you will be rewarded beyond your wildest dreams. But if I find a single thread connecting you to those men—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Talia stood in the center of the room, listening to his footsteps retreat down the marble hall. She looked at the luxury that surrounded her, the silk rugs, the priceless art, and felt the cold realization sink in. She had escaped the fire of the restaurant only to walk into a cage made of gold. And in Jae-Hyuk's world, the only thing more dangerous than being his enemy was being someone he couldn't quite figure out. The east wing of the Seo estate was a silent labyrinth of white marble and glass, a place so sterile it felt more like a museum than a home. Talia sat on the edge of a bed draped in silk that cost more than her 6 months of back rent, her eyes fixed on the door. Every footstep in the hallway sounded like a threat. She was still wearing her stained waitress shirt, a jarring contrast to the opulence surrounding her. She was a guest by title, but the 2 men stationed outside her door made it clear she was a prisoner by circumstance. A soft, hesitant knock broke the silence. The door creaked open, and Min-jun slipped inside. He had changed into a simple black sweater, his frame looking smaller, without the stiff structure of his suit jacket. The bandage on his temple was the only physical reminder of the glass that had rained down on them, but his eyes told a different story. They were wide, darting toward the hallway before he clicked the door shut. "You shouldn't be here," Talia whispered, standing up. "Your father thinks I'm a spy. If he finds you with me, he'll think I'm working you." Min-jun didn't leave. He walked toward the window, looking out at the dark silhouette of the mountains. "He thinks everyone is a spy. That's how he stays alive. But I know you aren't." Talia crossed her arms, her skepticism surfacing through her exhaustion. "How? Because I dragged you through a sewer? People do a lot of things for a big enough payout, Min-jun. Your father told me that himself." The boy turned to face her, his expression shifting from fear to a strange, weary clarity. "No. I believed you because of the slang. You said they were going to drop the hammer. My father didn't recognize it because he only speaks the English of boardrooms and back alleys in Seoul. But I've heard it before. From the men he pays to protect me." Talia froze. The air in the room suddenly felt as thin as it had in the service tunnels. "What are you talking about?" "The underboss, Mr. Park," Min-jun said, his voice barely audible. "He's been bringing in consultants from the States for months. He told my father they were security experts to help with the American expansion. But I've overheard them talking in the gym, using those same words. Drop the hammer. Clear the floor. They weren't talking about enemies, Talia. They were talking about us." He stepped closer, the moonlight catching the tremor in his hands. "I tried to tell my father weeks ago that something felt wrong, but he told me I was being soft, that I was imagining shadows. When you spoke up at the table, it wasn't just a warning. It was the proof I needed that the monsters were already inside the house." Talia looked at the boy, the heir to a multi-billion-won empire, and realized he wasn't a prince in a castle. He was a bird in a cage surrounded by cats. The luxury of the estate wasn't there to protect him. It was a curated perimeter designed to keep him isolated while the people his father trusted most prepared for the kill. "You're terrified of them," Talia realized, her voice softening. "Not just the men who attacked the restaurant. You're afraid of the men standing outside this door." Min-jun nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path through the dust still on his cheek. "My father thinks his power is a shield. He doesn't realize that his own men are the ones sharpening the knives. If you hadn't been there, we wouldn't have made it to the car. Mr. Park would have made sure of it." Talia felt a surge of that reckless empathy Jae-Hyuk had mocked. She saw herself in Min-jun, the person who sees the truth but is ignored because of their status. She was a waitress, he was a child. To a man like Jae-Hyuk, neither of them had a voice that mattered. If Mr. Park is the one behind this, Talia said, her mind already moving to the next move on the board, then your father is still in danger. This estate isn't a safe house. It's a trap that hasn't sprung yet. Minjun reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive. I swiped this from Park's office during the confusion when we arrived. I can't break the encryption, but I know it contains the payroll for the consultants. If my father sees this, he'll have to believe us. He held it out to her, his hand shaking. He won't listen to me. He thinks I'm a boy, and he doesn't trust you. But if we work together... Talia looked at the drive, then at the door where Jae-Hyuk's loyalists, or perhaps Park's traitors, stood guard. She realized that her role in this story had just shifted. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was the bridge between a father's pride and a son's survival. Hide it, Talia said, closing his fingers over the drive as footsteps approached in the hall. We have to be smart. If they see us together, they'll move the timeline up. We wait for the first mission. We wait for the moment your father has no choice but to rely on my ears. The door swung open, and Jae-Hyuk stood there, his shadow stretching across the silk sheets. He looked between them, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. Minjun, to your room. Now. As the boy scurried past his father, Jae-Hyuk stepped into the room, the scent of smoke and rain following him. He looked at Talia, his gaze landing on her hands, which she had quickly hidden behind her back. What did he tell you? Jae-Hyuk asked, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. Talia met his eyes, her face a mask of perfect, professional blankness, the same one she wore when a customer was being particularly cruel. He told me he was glad to be alive, Mr. Seo. Is that a crime in this house? Jae-Hyuk stared at her for a long beat, searching for a crack in her armor. Get some rest, Talia. Tomorrow, we see if your ears are as sharp as my son seems to think they are. The morning arrived not with the soft light of the mountains, but with the cold, mechanical click of a deadbolt. Jae-Hyuk stood in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. He wasn't wearing the battered suit from the night before. He was dressed in a charcoal overcoat that made him look like a statue carved from volcanic rock. In his hand, he held a small, flesh-colored earpiece and a sleek, high-end tablet. You've had your rest, he said, his voice as dry as parchment. Now it's time to see if you're an asset or a liability. 30 minutes later, Talia found herself in the back of a nondescript black SUV, a far cry from the armored luxury she expected. They were parked in the shadow of a decaying industrial district on the outskirts of Incheon, overlooking a rusted pier where a group of men stood huddled near a shipping container. Jae-Hyuk sat beside her, his eyes fixed on a monitor displaying a grainy thermal feed from a drone hovering miles above. The men on that pier are from the Atlantic Group, Jae-Hyuk murmured, handing her the earpiece. They're meeting with my underboss, Mr. Park. He claims he's negotiating a severance for the failed hit. I think he's negotiating a second attempt. Talia pressed the earpiece into place. Static hissed for a moment before the voices surged through, sharp, jagged, and heavily accented. It wasn't just English. It was a dialect thick with the specific jargon of private military contractors, layered with the rhythmic, double-meaning slang of the Atlanta underground she had grown up hearing. Listen, Jae-Hyuk commanded, his hand hovering near the record button. Tell me exactly what is being said. Not the words, the intent. Talia closed her eyes, tuning out the hum of the SUV's engine. The voices were distant, distorted by the wind on the pier. The ghost is still rattling. A deep, gravelly voice said in English. We need to ghost the ghost. The hammer didn't drop heavy enough at the restaurant. We need to go full eclipse at the exchange. Talia's blood turned to ice. She felt Jae-Hyuk's gaze on her, heavy and expectant. They're calling you the ghost, Talia whispered, her voice barely a breath. And full eclipse. Mr. Seo, that doesn't mean a negotiation. In that world, an eclipse is a total blackout. No communications, no survivors. They aren't talking about settling a debt. They're talking about an execution. Jae-Hyuk's jaw tightened, a vein pulsing in his temple. What about Park? What is his response? On the monitor, The figure of the underboss stepped closer to the mercenaries. The audio crackled as he spoke in broken English, his tone subservient yet calculating. "The boy," Park said. "The boy is the key. If he stays, the ghost stays. If he goes, the empire is mine." The mercenary laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "Don't worry about the cub. We've got a hollow point waiting for the ride home. Just make sure the gate stays unlatched." Talia felt a wave of nausea. She didn't need a dictionary to know what a hollow point meant for a teenage boy. She turned to Jae-Hyuk, her eyes wide with a frantic urgency. "They're going to kill Min-jun tonight. During the ride home, they've already compromised your security at the estate. Someone is leaving the gates open." Jae-Hyuk didn't move. For a long, terrifying minute, he sat in the darkness of the SUV, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his eyes. He looked at the pier, then at Talia, seeing the genuine terror on her face. This wasn't the performance of a spy. It was the raw panic of a woman who had seen a child's death warrant written in the air. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "I'd bet my life on it," Talia said, her voice cracking. "I grew up around men who talk like this, Mr. Seo. They think they're being clever because they're in a different country, but the language of betrayal is the same everywhere." Jae-Hyuk reached out, his fingers brushing the earpiece she wore. He didn't pull it away. Instead, he leaned in, his face inches from hers. "You've given me the truth, Talia. Now I have to decide what to do with the man who tried to sell my son." He tapped a button on the console, and the SUV's engine roared to life. "Park thinks he's playing a game of chess. He doesn't realize I've just changed the board." As they sped away from the pier, Talia realized the invisible thread had finally snapped. She had decoded the language of his destruction, and in doing so, she had become the only person Jae-Hyuk could trust in a world full of traitors. The waitress was gone. The shadow translator had taken her place. The air in the east wing of the estate had grown heavy, a suffocating velvet that seemed to press against Talia's chest. Jae-Hyuk was gone, coordinating a countermaneuver with the few men he still deemed loyal, leaving Talia in the gilded silence of her room. She paced the length of the silk rug. The USB drive Min-jun had given her hidden in the lining of her discarded waitress apron. She was no longer just a witness. She was a vault of secrets. And in this house, secrets were the only currency that mattered. A soft chime from the bedside intercom startled her. "Miss Henderson," a voice smooth as polished stone filtered through. "A delivery has been left for you in the solarium. Urgent." Talia hesitated. Every instinct told her to stay behind the heavy oak door, but the word urgent in this house usually meant a life was hanging by a thread. She moved through the darkened corridors, her footsteps muffled by the carpet, until she reached the glass-walled solarium. The moonlight filtered through the panes, casting long, skeletal shadows across the exotic ferns. There, sitting on a marble bistro table, was a simple manila envelope and a burner phone. Before she could touch them, the phone vibrated, its screen illuminating the dark room with a harsh, artificial glow. Talia picked it up, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "Talia," the voice on the other end said. It was Mr. Park, the underboss. His tone wasn't the subservient one he used with Jae-Hyuk. It was the cold, command-heavy voice of a man who already considered himself a king. "I know you're a smart girl. A girl from Atlanta doesn't end up in a place like the Obsidian unless she knows how to spot an opportunity." Talia's grip tightened on the plastic casing. "You're the one they're calling the unlatched gate, aren't you? You're the one letting the hammers in." Park laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "I'm the one offering you a way out. Open the envelope." Talia slid the contents onto the marble. It wasn't just paper. It was a series of bank transfer receipts and a high-end Swiss passport with her photograph on it, a photograph taken at the restaurant weeks ago. The balance on the receipts was staggering. More money than she would have earned in 10 lifetimes of double shifts. "That's $5 million, Talia," Park whispered. "Enough to disappear. Enough to never have to pour another drink for a man like Seo Jae-Hyuk. All you have to do is make sure the ghost and the cub take the mountain pass road tonight instead of the highway." Tell Jae-Hyuk you overheard the mercenaries planning an ambush on the main road. He'll believe you. He's already started to trust his shadow translator. The weight of the offer was physical. For a moment, Talia could almost see the life it bought. A house by the ocean, safety, an end to the constant, grinding fear of poverty. She looked at the passport, her ticket out of this nightmare. And what happens to Min-jun? Talia asked, her voice trembling. The boy is a casualty of progress, Park said dismissively. Jae-Hyuk is a relic. He's too cautious, too obsessed with honor in a world that only respects results. If you lead them to the pass, you'll be on a private jet to Zurich before the first shot is fired. Think about it, Talia. Why die for a man who looked at you like you were dirt until 48 hours ago? Talia looked at the ferns, their fronds swaying in the artificial breeze of the climate control. She thought of Jae-Hyuk's hand on the table, and the way Min-jun had looked at her in the tunnels, the only person who had truly seen him. She thought of the invisible thread and realized that Park was trying to use her own invisibility against her. He thought she was as hollow as he was. You're right about one thing, Mr. Park, Talia said, her voice finding a sudden, ironclad clarity. I do know how to spot an opportunity. She didn't wait for his reply. She ended the call and tucked the burner phone into her pocket alongside the USB drive. She looked at the $5 million on the table, the price of her silence, the cost of a boy's life. With a slow, deliberate motion, she tore the passport in half. She wasn't going to Zurich. Talia turned and sprinted toward the West Wing, toward the war room where Jae-Hyuk was preparing his final stand. She had spent her whole life being told she was nothing, that her voice didn't carry weight. But tonight, she held the life of a dynasty in her hands, and she was going to use it to burn the unlatched gate to the ground. The neon lights of Seoul's Myeongdong night market bled into the damp pavement, creating a fractured mosaic of pink, electric blue, and gold. To any onlooker, it was a typical Friday night. Crowds of tourists jostling for spicy rice cakes, the steam from street food stalls rising like ghosts into the cool air. But for Talia, every face in the crowd was a potential silhouette of a killer. Jae-Hyuk had been clear. They needed to draw Park's mercenaries out of the shadows and into a space where their full eclipse tactics would be hampered by witnesses and narrow alleys. Talia walked a half-step behind Min-jun, her hand hovering near the small of his back. She had traded her stained apron for a sleek, oversized trench coat that hid the burner phone and the USB drive, but she couldn't hide the frantic thrum of her pulse. Keep your eyes on the skewers, Min-jun, Talia whispered, her voice barely audible over the K-pop blasting from a nearby skincare boutique. Look like a kid who's hungry, not a prince who's hunted. Min-jun nodded, his face pale beneath the brim of a black baseball cap. He reached for a stick of Iamuktang, his fingers trembling. Somewhere in the sea of umbrellas and puffer jackets, Jae-Hyuk was watching. He was the invisible predator, using his own son as the tether. It was a gamble that made Talia's stomach churn, but in the language of the syndicate, bait was the only way to catch a shark. 3 o'clock, Talia murmured, her eyes catching a flicker of movement. The man in the gray windbreaker, with the headset. He's been following us since the subway station. She didn't look directly at him. She had learned the art of the peripheral glance at the obsidian, watching the reflection of a room in a wine glass. Gray windbreaker wasn't looking at the food. He was looking at Min-jun's neck. Turn left at the next stall, Talia commanded. The one with the silk scarves. There's a narrow staircase behind it that leads to the lower storage level of the market. They moved with a practiced casualness, weaving through a group of laughing students. The moment they stepped behind the vibrant hanging fabrics, the noise of the market muffled into a dull roar. Talia grabbed Min-jun's hand, her grip bruising, and broke into a sprint. They descended into a labyrinth of concrete corridors and stacked crates of produce. This was the belly of the market, a place of industrial fans and the smell of fermented cabbage. Behind them, the heavy metal door creaked open. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of combat boots echoed against the damp walls. He's not alone, Min-jun hissed, his breath hitching. I know, Talia said, her mind mapping the exits. They're flanking us. They think we're trapped. She pulled Minjun behind a stack of wooden pallets, her back pressed against the cold cinder block. She pulled the burner phone from her pocket and hit the speed dial. 1 ring.
2.
They're in the cellar, she whispered into the receiver. Sector 4. They've got the hollow points out. Jae-Hyuk. It's happening. A shadow stretched across the floor toward their hiding spot. Talia reached down and grabbed a heavy glass soy sauce bottle from an open crate, her knuckles white. She wasn't a soldier, and she wasn't a Mafia enforcer. But she was a woman who had spent 10 years navigating the dangerous moods of powerful men, and she knew exactly when to strike. The man in the gray windbreaker rounded the corner, his silenced pistol raised. Before he could squeeze the trigger, a flash of silver crossed his vision. Jae-Hyuk didn't come from the door. He dropped from the ventilation duct above, like a vengeful spirit. The struggle was short, brutal, and silent. Jae-Hyuk stood over the unconscious mercenary, his breathing shallow, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying satisfaction. He looked at Talia, who was still clutching the glass bottle, her chest heaving. He reached out and took the bottle from her hand, his fingers lingering on hers for a second too long. You have a talent for the cat and mouse, Talia, he murmured, the neon light from a high window catching the sharp line of his jaw. I'm tired of being the mouse, Talia snapped, her fear turning into a cold, hard anger. Good, Jae-Hyuk said, pulling a radio from the mercenary's vest. Because the cat just found the hole where Park is hiding. We leave the market now. The eclipse is over. It's time for the sun to go down on the underboss. As they stepped back out into the bright, noisy streets of Myeongdong, Talia realized the game had changed. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were hunting. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour by the time they reached the abandoned shipbreaking yard on the edge of the Incheon coast. The air tasted of salt, rust, and the metallic tang of impending violence. Jae-Hyuk led the way through the skeleton of a half-dismantled freighter, his suppressed pistol an extension of his arm. Talia kept Minjun pressed against the rusted hull, her eyes scanning the shadows for the shimmer of a scope or the shift of a tactical vest. They reached the central hold, a cavernous space lit by flickering industrial floodlights. Standing in the center, flanked by 6 of the Atlantic mercenaries, was Mr. Park. He looked smaller in the vastness of the shipyard, his tailored suit ruined by the damp, but his eyes were wide with the manic desperation of a man who had already burned his bridges. You should have taken the money, Talia, Park shouted, his voice echoing off the hollow steel walls. You could have been on a beach. Instead, you're in a graveyard. Jae-Hyuk stepped into the light, his silhouette a sharp, dark blade against the gloom. The only person in a graveyard, Park, is the man who thought he could sell my son's life for a seat at my table. The tension snapped like a high-tension wire. The first shot didn't come from a mercenary. It came from the shadows behind Park. One of Jae-Hyuk's loyalists had circled around, and the hold erupted into a chaotic symphony of gunfire and screaming metal. Stay down, Talia screamed, shoving Minjun into a recessed alcove behind a massive iron winch. She looked up just in time to see the lead mercenary, the one they called the Fixer, leveling his rifle at Jae-Hyuk's back. Jae-Hyuk was occupied with 2 others, his focus divided, his life hanging by a thread he couldn't see. Talia didn't have a gun. She didn't have armor. But she had the heavy, jagged piece of a shattered coolant pipe she'd scavenged from the floor. She lunged from the shadows, her scream lost in the roar of the battle. She didn't aim for the Fixer's heart. She slammed the iron pipe into his knee with every ounce of terror and fury she had suppressed since the night at the restaurant. The mercenary buckled, his shot going wild and sparking off the ceiling. He spun, his heavy boot catching Talia in the ribs with a sickening thud. She flew backward, her breath leaving her lungs in a sharp, agonizing burst. The world blurred into a haze of gray and red, the sound of her own heartbeat drowning out the gunfire. She watched, through a veil of pain, as the Fixer recovered, his face a mask of primal rage. He raised his sidearm, pointing it directly at her forehead. Talia! Minjun's voice was a distant wail. A single shot rang out, louder and sharper than the rest. The fixers had snapped back, and he slumped into the oily water on the floor. Jae-Hyuk stood 10 feet away, his weapon smoking, his eyes fixed on Talia with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. But the danger wasn't over. Park had crawled toward the winch where Min-jun was hiding, a small, concealed blade glinting in his hand. He was going for the leverage, the only thing that could still save his life. Talia forced herself up, her ribs screaming in protest, her vision swimming. She saw the blade move toward Min-jun. She didn't think about the $5 million or the passport. She threw herself across the gap, her hand catching the jagged edge of the winch's rusted cable. The wire sliced deep into her palm, blood blooming instantly against the rust, but the jolt gave her the leverage to kick Park's arm away. The blade clattered to the floor. Before Park could reach for it, Jae-Hyuk was there. He didn't shoot. He grabbed Park by the throat, his fingers digging into the carotid artery with a cold, clinical precision. "You didn't just betray me," Jae-Hyuk whispered, his voice more terrifying than the gunfire. "You tried to take the only person who reminded me I was human." He flung Park away like a piece of refuse. The remaining loyalists moved in to finish the cleaning. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of rain from the rafters. Talia slumped against the winch, her hand clutched to her chest, the blood soaking through her sleeve. She felt a hand on her shoulder, warm, steady, and for the first time, unmistakably gentle. Jae-Hyuk knelt beside her. He didn't look at the carnage or his defeated underboss. He looked at Talia's mangled hand, then at her eyes. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch no longer a test, but a vow. "You're bleeding," he murmured, his voice thick with a strange, unreadable emotion. "I'm alive," Talia wheezed, a small, defiant smile breaking through the pain. "Which is more than I can say for your business partners." Jae-Hyuk let out a short, breathy laugh, the first real sound of mirth she'd heard from him. He stood, pulling her up with him, his arms supporting her weight, so she didn't have to stand alone. Min-jun joined them, his face wet with tears and rain, grabbing Talia's other hand. As they walked out of the rusted hull and into the gray light of dawn, Talia realized the cost of her victory. She was wounded, she was exhausted, and she was forever tied to a man who ruled by blood. But as Jae-Hyuk pulled her closer against the wind, she knew she wasn't the waitress anymore. She was the one who had survived the eclipse, and the shadow she now walked in was her own. The morning air in the Seo estate was different now, no longer heavy with a suffocating scent of suspicion, but crisp and sharp with the finality of a war won. Talia stood on the expansive stone terrace overlooking the mist-shrouded valleys of Bukhansan. Her hand was encased in a professional white bandage, a clean, stark reminder of the wire that had sliced through her palm to save a life. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit her like a second skin, a far cry from the scratchy, oversized uniforms of the service industry. The sound of slow, rhythmic footsteps echoed on the stone behind her. She didn't flinch. She knew the gait of the man approaching. She had memorized the cadence of his movements in the dark of the service tunnels and the chaos of the shipyard. Seo Jae-Hyuk stepped into the light, carrying a silver basin in one hand and a single, folded piece of fabric in the other. It was her old waitress apron, the dark cotton still stained with the wine of the restaurant and the soot of the explosion. He set the basin on the low stone wall between them and dropped the apron into it. Without a word, he produced a gold lighter. The flame flickered once, twice, before catching the fabric. Talia watched as the fire consumed the symbol of her invisibility. The white ties blackened and curled. The pockets that had once held pens and meager tips turned to gray ash that the mountain wind carried away into the pines. "The girl who cleared my plates is dead," Jae-Hyuk said, his voice a low, resonant hum. He didn't look at the fire. He looked only at her. She was a ghost. She was a witness. She was someone the world ignored until it almost cost me everything. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a leather-bound folder. He didn't slide it across the table like a bribe. He held it out with a level of respect that felt heavier than any mountain. Minjun is safe, he continued, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second at the mention of his son. He is back in school, and for the first time in his life, he isn't looking over his shoulder. He tells me he wants to learn English, real English. Your English. Talia took the folder, her bandaged fingers brushing against his. The heat from the burning basin was still radiating between them, a bridge of fire they had both crossed. She opened a folder to find a contract, but it wasn't for service or protection. Chief of Intelligence, Talia read aloud, the words tasting strange and powerful on her tongue. My empire was built on iron and blood, Jae-Hyuk said, stepping closer until the scent of his sandalwood cologne was all she could breathe. But Park showed me that iron can be melted and blood can be sold. What I lacked was ears. I lacked a shadow that could hear the whispers before they became screams. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she was meant to decode. I don't want a servant, Talia. I don't even want a partner who agrees with me. I want the woman who had the courage to point a finger at a king and tell him he was being lied to. I want the ears that saved my lineage. Talia looked down at the contract, then back at the man who had gone from her greatest threat to her most dangerous ally. She thought of the $5 million she had walked away from and the Swiss passport she had torn in half. Those were exits. This was an entrance. And if I hear something you don't want to know, Jae-Hyuk? She asked, using his name without the formal titles for the first time. If the truth I find is one that hurts the king? A slow, genuine smile ghosted across Jae-Hyuk's lips, the look of a man who had finally found someone worth trusting. Then you tell me. And we burn the world down together. Talia didn't need a pen. She looked at the horizon, where the sun was finally breaking through the soul mist, illuminating the city where she had once been nothing. She closed the folder and tucked it under her arm. I'll need a better office than the solarium, she said, her voice steady and full of the authority she had finally claimed. Jae-Hyuk offered his arm, not to lead her, but to walk beside her. You'll have the top floor, Talia. You'll be the first thing the city sees, and the last thing my enemies hear. As they walked back into the estate, the invisible thread was finally gone, replaced by a bond forged in gunpowder and truth. The waitress was a memory. The chief of intelligence had taken her seat at the table.